himself and headed up the Club for Growth. He's also a pilot. Now he seeks to be a U.S. Senator. Thanks again for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Let's talk about President Obama and what you think of him. Newt Gingrich has a new book out called Save America, and he says that the president has a secular socialist agenda. Do you believe that?
I'm not sure I would call it socialism, but it is a vast expansion in the size of government by any measure, by the amount of money that the government is spending, certainly. You know, for 60 years in this country, the federal government spent on average 20% of GDP, very little fluctuations, regardless of the administration or Congress. In the first year, he took that to 25% of GDP. That's a 25% increase in the size of government. You look at the stimulus bill, the $800 billion stimulus bill that Joe Sestak says wasn't big enough. It was about growing government. Big transfer payments to other levels of government, expanding government, creating and saving government
jobs. The Democratic
jobs.
side says it wasn't about growing government, it was about saving the United States system.
You know, where anybody gets the idea that going out and borrowing and spending several $100 billion when we've already borrowed and spent too much, that's somehow going to save our economy is a very misguided idea. I don't buy it.
If you look at left and right, I'd like to get your take on a couple of things. The National Journal has given Joe Sestak a liberal rating of 77 out of 100 in 2009. Professors Poole and Rosenthal have what's called the DW Nominate Scale, and basically that analyzes roll call votes and places senators and congressmen and women on either left of center axis or right. Now, they put him left of the axis but kind of centrist among Democrats. They put you pretty far to the right. When you're 3 terms in Congress. And Harry Enton, writing Pollster.com, said, indeed, of the 1,004 legislators to receive a DW Nominate score for their career since 1995, Toomey ranked as the 22nd most conservative, about as conservative as Jesse Helms. Are you, define conservatism for you. How conservative are you?
Well, first of all, let's also keep in mind that Joe Sestak, according to his own campaign, listed the very numerous, very liberal organizations that give him 100% ratings. And this year he has voted with Nancy Pelosi 100% of the time. So I think that's pretty clear where he is on the spectrum. Look, I believe in limited government. I don't think the government is the solution to all of our problems. I think the federal government has grown too big. I think it's spending too much. I think we should have a balanced budget instead of these massive deficits. I'd like to see lower taxes rather than higher taxes. On all of these, Joe and I disagree. I think ultimately the source of prosperity and opportunity is the private sector. Government jobs have to be paid for by the productive private sector. They are not a solution in themselves. And so
well, I guess the question is, in the hindsight or the mind view of the Pennsylvania voter, if the Pennsylvania voter has voted for every Democratic president basically since Bill Clinton, if someone is closer to Clinton, is that more likely to be elected than someone who is closer to Reagan?
Not in a time when the government has grown the way it has, that's for sure. And keep in mind also that Pennsylvania voters have also given us an overwhelming Republican majority in the state Senate, virtually a tie in the state House. I happen to think we're going to have a Republican-elected governor later this year, and the most county executives and county governments are controlled by Republicans. So we're a divided state. Politically, but there's a lot of sort of common sense conservatism and an understanding that you can't borrow and spend your way to prosperity, and that we shouldn't be the first generation in American history to saddle our kids with so much debt that they can't reach the standard of living that we've become accustomed to.
You've spoken to a lot of Tea Party groups. I've been at a number of groups moderating forums and debates and listening, and I hear some of this from them. First of all, that F&M survey that said about 45% of Pennsylvanians identify at least somewhat with the Tea Party movement. How much entitlement reform do you want to do?
Well, I think we have to reform our entitlement programs. Let's face it; they're enormous, they're unsustainable. The demographics are not going to change. Demographics are very predictable. So I think if we're going to get our budget situation under control, and we need to.
So not around the edges, some serious.
No, we're going to need significant reforms.
Do you want to abolish the Federal Department of Education?
You know, I don't know that we need to abolish it. There's probably a lot that it does that it doesn't need to do, and so I'd be very much in favor of getting rid of all of that.
What about the Environmental Protection Agency?
No, I think the Environmental Protection Agency plays a necessary role.
Did they play the role they should have played in this oil spill in the Gulf?
I think we're still learning that. I mean, I don't think it's quite clear yet exactly what went wrong and why it went wrong, and we certainly have to understand that so that we can prevent it from ever going wrong again. That's a huge disaster.
What do you think of the Obama administration's response?
Well, I think so far they've allocated a lot of resources to this, and that's what they ought to be doing. We've got to do everything we can to protect the sensitive coastal areas that are threatened by this.
Well, you saw how George
cyclone.
Bush was criticized after Katrina. Do you think that this president's not being held to the same standard?
That's not clear to me. I think the president should be held to a very rigorous standard, but my impression is that he is devoting a lot of resources to try to prevent a disaster spill from being cataclysmic.
All right, got to take another break. More with Congressman Pat Toomey in a moment on NBC 10 at Issue. Stay tuned.
You're watching NBC.